There are lots of rumors and misunderstanding about Celtic mythology, and you might have a few questions. Did monks make it all up as Christian propaganda? Can we trust translators? Is Celtic itself a problematic term? Speaking of terms, let's start by defining ours. There are different definitions of myth within different fields of study, but for us, I think this is a good one. Myths are stories people have believed for many generations, which cannot be fully confirmed, usually concerning their own origins, culture, and gods. These stories have a high degree of stability over time. In an oral culture, these may be preserved by a recognized group of professionals. Within this definition, a lot of the stories we think of as Celtic mythology are not quite myths in some sense. They're often more like the first cousins of myth. They're a little bit literary. Some of the characters are clearly gods, and some are clearly mortals, and sometimes it's hard to tell. That's probably because these stories were written down in a time when people weren't really thinking about gods and goddesses as much anymore. They had just become stories of magic. That said, let's be relaxed about using the term Celtic mythology. It may not be entirely accurate from a scholarly viewpoint, but it's a handy, everyday way of referring to a pretty well defined set of stories. So, what about Celtic? How do we define that? There have been some rather heated arguments about the term Celtic over the past 50 years or so. This is really the result of scholars from different academic disciplines getting at loggerheads. From the point of view of many archaeologists, there isn't much which can broadly define a set of people as Celtic. The pottery and weapons that people make, the kinds of houses they build, and so on. People we know spoke a Celtic language don't always look that different from their neighbors when it comes to these things. Celts was originally applied only to the ancient people of Gaul, who the Greeks and Romans called Celts. At least some of these people probably called themselves Celts. So this map shows our best understanding of where in Europe these early Celtic speakers were. Obviously, the modern countries and borders didn't exist at the time, but it's a good way to make sense of where Celtic people were living in the Iron Age. At the other end of the spectrum in this debate about Celtic are the linguists. They can clearly see that there's a well-defined group of languages, both modern and ancient, known as Celtic languages. Language is deeply connected to the more intangible aspects of culture, like religious beliefs, the stories people tell, and how people see themselves and how they see the world. These things do cross linguistic boundaries, but not that easily. You may be wondering about genetic heritage, but looking at someone's DNA doesn't tell you what language they spoke or what their religion was. This debate about who gets to be a Celt usually finds certain archaeologists taking the position known as Celtoscepticism. What this means is that they're being very narrow in their definition of the continental Celts and usually unwilling to view the people of Britain and Ireland as Celtic. Most of the linguists and people who study medieval texts are lined up on the opposing team, and sometimes they're called traditionalists. They can see a clear connection between the languages of Gaul and those of Britain and Ireland. It's there. And they tend to be more aware of other intangible commonalities like customs or religious beliefs. There have been a few books written for the popular market and a few silly newspaper headlines about all this. The result is that people from outside the academic debate sometimes think there's no such thing as Celtic, or Celtic is a really problematic term, and they will use phrases like that to browbeat people in online arguments. Usually, they don't really understand the wider discussion going on behind the scenes, not to mention lacking good manners. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who are very quick to label all sorts of things Celtic, which really shouldn't be. If you're writing or speaking formally or publicly, it helps to be clear about how you're using the word, but we don't need to stop using it. So, just to recap, An acceptable academic definition might be people who speak a Celtic language and or people of ancient Gaul who were called Celts, at least by others. In everyday usage, that definition might reasonably be a bit wider. People and regions where Celtic languages are spoken or were recently spoken, like within the last few generations. That could be broadened to places where the prevailing culture is perceived to be Celtic. That perception is often subjective, though, and hard to define. Below this video, you'll find links to a couple of articles on the Celtoscepticism debate, one from each side. The Celtoskeptic one is a bit long, but it's worth reading the first page or two if this interests you, because the author summarizes the discussion so far. The Traditionalist one by Patrick Sims Williams is extremely witty and very entertaining, but it's also based on very good scholarship. Back to Celtic mythology. Let's think about how these stories have made their way into our world. Obviously, people have always told stories, and we can see relationships between the stories told in medieval Celtic manuscripts and the ancient traditional stories of other Indo-European cultures. So while the stories of Ireland and Wales are unique, they're obviously part of something very old, which was developing when the Indo-European language family was young. This chart reflects reasonable dates for the development of Indo-European, Common Celtic, Insular Celtic, and the earliest versions of Irish and Welsh. This isn't a complete or nuanced picture, it's just to give you an idea. And while these dates are widely accepted, they're educated guesses. So how were these stories preserved? According to Roman writers in the first few centuries AD, the early Druids and bards committed vast amounts of lore to memory, and this tradition was continued by the poets and storytellers of Wales and Ireland, even into the early modern period. The Druids appear to have been either part of the nobility or equal to them in status in the Iron Age, and closely intertwined with them. The later bards and fili, which are also types of poets, served many similar functions, praising their royal patrons, entertaining in their courts, instructing their children, and recording their laws and genealogies. Around the 7th century, we think both Britons and the Irish began to write their lore down. In both cases, this stems from the tradition of monastic scholarship. The monastic scholars doing this work were recording their own native tradition, of which they were obviously proud. We don't fully understand their motivations nor their process, and it's not entirely clear what kind of people were doing this work within the monasteries. Some of it may have been commissioned by their noble patrons, and some because of their own interests. However, while monastic life certainly had a strong focus on religion, many individuals may have been at least as attracted to the life of scholarship as they were to Christian devotion. In fact, in an earlier era, these individuals might have been chosen to become druids. I'm not suggesting that monasteries were hotbeds of underground paganism. What I mean is that the church offered many of the same things that being a druid offered a few centuries before: the chance to devote yourself to learning and the path to spirituality, power, and status. No doubt, many of these scribes were steeped from early childhood in the stories they recorded. Some may have simply written down what they knew. Others might have approached professional storytellers to record stories from them. Often, I think the old Celtic habit of preservation will have been the driving force, but in other cases, the scribe or someone else will have acted more as an author, putting old stories in their own words and adjusting them to suit themselves and their times. And yes, sometimes this was done to make a religious point, but other times it was more of a literary decision. Eventually, the manuscript tradition began to die out, and with the exception of a few collectors, so did the interest in their content. Many manuscripts languished in libraries of monasteries and noble houses for centuries. Many were lost or destroyed. In the late 18th century, scholars in Ireland and Wales started to take a greater interest in the surviving manuscripts, and by the mid-19th century, there was a great project of editing and translating that had begun. These 19th and early 20th century translators produced a volume of work which scholars in university departments rarely have time to compete with. What these editors and translators lacked in knowledge, they made up for in enthusiasm and dedication to their work. More modern translations have the benefit of another century of research into Celtic languages, but I have immense respect for the 19th century translators who had the courage to do so much heavy lifting. What their translations lack in accuracy, they often make up for in their desire to create highly readable translations, something which isn't valued as much in the academic world today. And it is important to have access to good scholarly translations of Celtic texts. I want to talk a little bit about the translation process because people don't always trust it. If you'd like to delve a little deeper into the topics in my videos, you might enjoy taking one of my online classes. You can find out more about them at the link which is on your screen now. You can also support my work on Ko-fi or by becoming a patron. You'll also find free content to read on my Patreon page and on my website. All the links are in the description. Translation of manuscripts begins with making what's called an edition. This is a process of figuring out what the manuscript says because they're often hard to read. Careful annotations are made about possible variant readings where the handwriting isn't clear. The editor may create an index and a glossary of unusual words. They might provide notes about the history of the manuscript, how old it is, where it came from, and then they've made an edition. This editor may then go on to translate the text into a modern language, or they may leave that for someone else to do. Sometimes several different translators may use the same edition of a text because it's considered to be of a very high standard. Readers often mistrust translators on grounds of both scholarship and agenda. Even though some translators are not sympathetic to what we might call pagan themes, they're likely to be honest in the way they translate. Most translators of Celtic texts are completely focused on accuracy. Their reputation depends on it. With a few exceptions, such as the Mabinogion or the Toyn, which the general public might buy as a paperback to read, translators are writing for an academic audience these days and are translating for other academics more than for the wider public. As consumers of translated Celtic material, I think we need to be honest with ourselves about what we want from a translation. There's a time and a place for a very literal translation, but those of you who are bilingual will know that it's impossible to create a 100% literal translation of a long text. Any attempt to do so will require lots and lots and lots of footnotes, and that's what you'll find in a good scholarly translation. However, if a translator is trying to be super literal, they can actually lose the average reader. Things may just feel very clunky, and the constant need to check footnotes breaks the flow. So there's definitely room for what is sometimes called a literary translation, or even a faithful paraphrase of someone else's translation. This is where the author is careful to convey the original meaning, not to add anything or leave anything out, but to put everything into a cohesive style, which flows naturally for the reader. This may also benefit from a few footnotes, and that isn't a bad thing. In the description I've just given you of the monastic scribes with its ifs and maybes and the translators and so on, I've tried to present a balance of possibilities. In the 19th century, most Celtic scholars were working from what we call the nativist position. This tended to see the scribes as being fed material from the ancient oral tradition, and while the Christian influence was clear in many texts, the assumption was that the scribes were motivated primarily by preservation. As the 20th century progressed, that position changed. The same texts were seen more as literary productions, borrowing from native motifs, but authored from an almost entirely Christian standpoint. So far, that's the popular position in the 21st century, too, although there are always a minority of respected experts who are more nativist in their outlook. The fact is that not enough is known about the scribal period to settle these questions. I admit to leaning fairly strongly to the nativist side, but I try not to be starry eyed about it. Nativism and anti nativism are really just academic fashions or personal preferences. I've included a link below the video to a paper which discusses the debate between these two positions, in case you're interested. As a Celtic polytheist, I find Celtic myth informative, inspiring, and sometimes deeply touching. However, I try to be as objective as I can when I teach about Celtic mythology. I don't find those things incompatible, and I'm always impressed by how durable these stories and poems are. Their ability to keep giving to every new generation of readers keeps me coming back to them. And I think you can be confident that they will continue to do that if you take the time to study them.